Hey everyone, Richard from Digital Foundry here, and this is Batman Arkham Knight, the dreaded PC version, but somehow we've managed to get it running at a LOX 4K resolution at 60 frames per second, and I think it looks pretty awesome. Now, why are we doing this? Well, to begin with, I wanted to see whether the new RTX technology from Nvidia could actually push this game to a LOX 4K 60. But then I had a quick chat with John, who's also been replaying the game with significantly less powerful hardware. So John, why don't you talk us through your setup?
Yeah, so after you were talking about testing on the 2080 Ti, I thought, let's see what we're getting on a different machine. So I'm running the final Pascal Titan XP card with an i9 10 core, 32 gigs of RAM installed to a mechanical drive, believe it or not. It's a new drive. It's pretty fast, but I was curious to see how it would fare. My initial results suggested that, yeah, the game is still troublesome. I was getting a lot of slowdown in the intro sequences. It was somewhat unstable in the city. But after downloading Chaldean's Batman Tweak 1.01 tool, and he's a great friend of the PC community, doing all kinds of things like this for newly released PC games, I made a few tweaks here and there, and it actually seems to have helped. So going back through the intro, I'd say it's about 99% locked at 60 frames per second. You get those occasional judders here and there, but overall, like even when driving around in the Batmobile at high speeds through the city, I was surprised that this hardware was able to get there, but I shouldn't be, because the hardware is way beyond what was available at the time. But it kind of thought, like, are we pushing beyond the flaws of the port with more powerful hardware, or have things actually been improved?
I think possibly a combination of both, but I think the reason why we're actually looking at this, first of all, when we took a look at Spider-Man on the PlayStation 4 recently, we kind of gained a new appreciation for what Arkham Knight was doing 3 years ago. And of course, Arkham Knight never received any kind of support for the enhanced consoles, PS4 Pro, Xbox One X, which means that, like it or not, the PC version is our only avenue for taking what is an awesome game and running it beyond its original 1080p 30 PlayStation 4 spec. And I think, well, from my perspective, the artwork just looks phenomenal at 4K.
Yeah, that's actually something that really stuck out to me as well. I mean, the anti-aliasing is relatively limited, but even still, because this is based on a heavily modified Unreal Engine 3, that seems like an engine that's specialized a lot in like that super high frequency detail artwork, and that kind of artwork really does benefit from the massive resolution increase. So when you compare it to the console version at 1080p or even 900p in the case of the Xbox, it's a noticeable increase. Though at the same time, I did notice that a lot of the effects like depth of field, some of the rain effects, things like that, they're clearly designed for 1080p output, so when they scale up to 4K, they do look a little different, and it loses some of the grit that you might have had with its original form. But overall, I do think it looks better. I don't know, it's tough to say. I mean, in some ways, I think this does look better than even Spider-Man.
Yeah, I just think in many ways the quality of the artwork just still shines. In particular, as you pointed out back in the Spider-Man video, the character rendering is just incredible.
Yeah, that's these guys. I mean, the previous Arkham games prior to Arkham Knight, I never thought they looked great in that regard, but somehow like their artists and like the cinematography and everything was just ramped up to a remarkably impressive level. This is still a gorgeous game, and revisiting on the PC reminded me that even though I know it has its detractors, I'm actually a big fan of what they did here, and I like the Batmobile and the puzzles around it. But I guess the challenge then is, let's say you have that bug in your bonnet and you want to try to play it again. It's this PC version, or you're back at 1080p 30. And yeah, the results have been interesting with the different cards you've tested.
Yeah, I think, well, back in the day there were several issues. First of all, certain visual features were missing.
That's right.
Like water layers when it was raining, which, really wasn't good. I think they fixed that. Then there was the fact that the game was basically a write-off on 2GB VRAM GPUs, which were basically far more widespread back in 2015. I don't think that has changed. This game is still massively awfully hungry on VRAM. And also I think there is a CPU issue here. I just think that it requires a massive amount of overhead. You're playing on a Core i9-7900X, I'm using an 8700K, but anything slower than an i7-7700K dropped frames would start to manifest, especially during those Batmobile sections. And I think the bottom line is that when we're assessing this game and trying to get a locked 60 frames per second, the problem is that you have these streaming spikes or bandwidth spikes depending on the kind of scene being rendered, and the performance level is almost defined by the worst bits, and you have to kind of leave a massive amount of overhead in order to basically get consistency here. And when you don't have that consistency, when you get those drops to frame rate, partly because of the double buffered VSync setup here, the frame rate drops really hard.
Yeah, it certainly does. And part of this does seem to be a legacy issue with Unreal Engine 3 in general. There's a lot of Unreal Engine 3 games in the PC, and all of those that seem to attempt some sort of streaming like this do tend to exhibit these types of stutters. But because of the massive increase in artwork complexity, the amount of VRAM and RAM that it requires, I feel like this is the game that just kind of pushed it to the breaking point. And, you know, we are where we're at here.
Yeah, and let's talk about some of the testing I did, because I've done a vast amount of testing over the last few days. First of all, you've got to completely rule out the inbuilt performance benchmark. It's total junk. I think Alex mentioned that in his benchmarking video a while back.
Yeah.
It doesn't represent the game in any way, shape or form. However, luckily, the first 10 minutes or so of the game is actually a pretty strong workout for the engine. And there are basically, you can test the cutscenes, which cause issues, and you can test the Batmobile, which is the kind of classic problem area for Arkham Knight. And that's what I did. First of all, I tested GTX 1060 at 1080p and 1070 at 1440p, and you can see that, yeah, we're having these issues with double buffer VSync causing some really noticeable stutter, mostly in cutscenes on these two cards, and yeah, that's not great, but we'll return to this in a minute because this game is so maddening to test. But yeah, the bottom line is that 1060 and 1070, these are the cards you need to run at 1080p and 1440p at 60 frames per second, preferably with a fast CPU for absolute consistency, because you are basically looking to push up those downward spikes as much as possible, and it is just a case of having a massive amount of overhead. And after that, I thought to myself, well, 1080 probably isn't going to cut it for 4K, and you can see that here. It's just not fast enough whatsoever. But the 1080 Ti, which is kind of similar to your Titan XP, shapes up a lot better at 4K. And again, here's the thing, this is again kind of maddening. The 1080 Ti isn't quite as powerful as your Titan, but you seem to be getting consistently better results in areas like the cutscenes and the diner, which are kind of traditionally a bit of an issue here.
Yeah, that is something that's very strange. And looking at, if you uncap everything and run with VSync off, you can kind of see that the card is just hovering around that mark. Like, you're just at the limit where it's enough over 60 FPS that you can kind of hit that solid frame rate on this machine. But it's not so high that, even just like a 2 FPS drop is enough to trigger that massive loss in performance. And I feel like that's probably where you're at with the 1080 Ti there, because it's so close, but just not quite there in terms of pushing over that limit.
Yeah, but obviously the 2080 Ti has got a good 30% plus overhead. And again, we're able to push higher. We do finally get a blocked 4K 60. Pretty much, I think out of 18,000 frames tested, 18 were dropped, which is kind of not really noticeable during the run of play, and that's what you're seeing in the main footage feed that you're seeing here. But we aren't running on max settings here, and that's maybe something we should talk about as well, because first of all, there's the GameWorks settings, which...
yes.
Okay, so you have these two settings, interactive smoke and interactive paper debris, which actually use a different executable entirely. It flips from DX11 back to DX10 for some reason. No idea why. The paper debris doesn't really add much to the game. The interactive smoke tanks performance, even on the RTX 2080 Ti at 4K. Then there are the other two effects, enhanced rain effects and enhanced light shafts.
Yeah, I'm sure if we do very close comparisons or look at the specific spots where they're used, there's probably a difference, but I feel like there's nothing obvious about them just during normal play, and honestly the effects are so good as is that I just don't feel it's worth turning them on at all.
And then we're talking about the general performance settings, the level of detail, we have that on high. But curiously, you chose normal shadow quality.
Yeah, so, shadow quality is always one of the first things I turn down. And especially in a game like this, I feel like the perceptible difference during gameplay between high and normal is almost nil. It's not really in, super sharp shadows, not that it necessarily goes for that. Not the most realistic looking thing either, so normal is a great way to save maybe a little bit of performance, especially when we're just kind of riding on the cusp there. And yeah, with those settings, and I'm using the texture streaming set to balanced, and yeah, it seems to be pushing along nicely on my system there without any of those nasty spikes that I was seeing initially. I'm also doing maximum pre-rendered frames 1 frame, forcing VSync. And I changed my texture LOD bias to -1, which kind of further slightly increases the sharpness of some of the textures.
Right.
Although it can also cause a few little sparkly artifacts at points. But in general, it looks really great in this game.
Well, okay. So here's the thing. I went back. This is why this game is so maddening, because I went back. I thought to myself, we aren't covering AMD here. And so I went back and tested RX 580 and at 1080p, Vega 56 at 1440p. It was a flawless 60 frames per second. I think one dropped frame across those 18,000 frame run. And I thought to myself, obviously, we aren't getting those results on the 1060. So then I went back to the 1060 immediately after the 580, and I got a similarly perfect run that I didn't get the last time around. And, this is what is infuriating about this game. You don't ever really seem to get any kind of consistency. So I thought to myself, well, John seems to be getting a better result from his Titan XP than I'm getting from my 1080 Ti, but I went back to the 1080 Ti and it was exactly the same. But what I will say is that if you set the maximum frame rate higher than 60, use VSync, and then at the GPU control panel level on NVIDIA cards set adaptive, this basically keeps double buffering, but the VSync turns into tearing, but the frame rate drops are nowhere near as pronounced as you can see on the 1080 Ti here. But obviously that's not entirely the best way forward, and in my experience, RTX 2080 Ti was the only way to run this locked at 4K 60. So we've got this amazing looking game now, so I think we should talk a little bit about why we think it's worth revisiting. So Spider-Man is considerably inspired by this one, and there's a lot of similarities in terms of mission design and obviously the open world.
Yeah, I think at a core there are a lot of similarities. The combat, for instance, the stealth system, a lot of those elements do remind me of the Batman games, but there is something about these Arkham titles. They're just dripping with atmosphere in a different way than Spider-Man is, and I really appreciate their more bespoke mission designs. You can see it right away in this early section, like Ace Chemicals. It's a series of puzzles that you have to solve, some combat challenges. It's almost like a little mini dungeon, and this is kind of what they've always done well in this series, where you're exploring the world, you're doing these mini missions in between the main missions, but when you actually get down to do the main story missions, they all feel really unique and super well designed. And again, I for whatever reason, I find the Batmobile puzzles really interesting, where you're essentially using the Batmobile, its capabilities, to solve different barriers and get through the level. And it's kind of a fun concept, and I really like that aspect of the game. And there's just the presentation, the atmosphere of exploring that city is really just unmatched. They did a phenomenal job with that.
Yeah, the Ace Chemicals section, I really enjoyed that from a storytelling perspective as well, because it's the first time you meet the Arkham Knight, and it's clear that he's a figure from Batman's past, but he's got kind of out-of-date knowledge of Batman's methods and technology, so you initially defeat him by using capabilities of the Batmobile that he's not fully aware of. Who is this guy? How does he know Batman so well? Why has he got the gaps in this knowledge of how he operates? I thought that was absolutely fascinating. It ties in beautifully with the various set pieces in that area as well, which again kind of reminded me of what they're trying to do in certain areas of Spider-Man as well.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And, the storytelling is similar, but one thing I really noticed here in Arkham Knight again is just the amazing camera work. a lot of the cutscenes, they transition directly from gameplay into the cutscene and then back out of the cutscene into gameplay. Spider-Man kind of does that with the transition out of the cutscenes, but there's a lot of these long camera angles, like early on, like when you find Poison Ivy behind in that cell. The camera sort of zooms in to show her there. She starts walking towards the door, and then it slowly pans over to the door, and you get this nitty-gritty look at like the little metal pieces and the bolts and like right along the floor, and you see like all these little tiny details that the game is focusing on. That feels, it's a different type of I guess cinematic style than you typically see in a game, and I appreciate all of these swooping camera angles and the focus on the detail, and there's just something really appealing about the overall way that they structure all this. And after just sampling that intro, I've kind of started playing this again, and this is just after coming off of almost platinuming Spider-Man, so now I'm back into Arkham Knight.
Yeah, I agree with you. Some of the camera work is breathtaking, particularly when they're using that kind of radar batarang to highlight the various areas of the terrain.
Oh, yes.
It does highlight, though, that it is still a game of its time. Now, there's two ways to look at this. First of all, by 2015, Unreal Engine 3 is essentially obsolete, and it's clear that Rocksteady have kind of pushed it kicking and screaming way beyond its intended lifespan. So the idea that this really old technology is capable of producing results like this is kind of mind-boggling in a way, but there it is. It just looks really, really good, and it still holds up today, I think, possibly from a design perspective more than a technology perspective, because you can kind of see here that the physically based rendering approximation that I think they're going for here doesn't really hold up compared to titles that we see in the modern era, and as you pointed out earlier, anti-aliasing as well.
Yeah, I could really use some temporal anti-aliasing to smooth out the shader aliasing that is very prevalent. Materials wise, though, I mean, I do kind of agree with you on the building materials and the environments somewhat, but the textures and materials used on the characters, like the metal plates on Batman and on the Batmobile and all the different elements of the costumes, especially with the rain layer, it's, to me, that still looks phenomenal.
Yeah, this is very definitely a case where the quality of the original artwork and the design choices made there kind of eclipse the limitations in technology. I mean, obviously, physically based lighting and materials handling has come on leaps and bounds in the last few years.
Yeah, and I definitely agree with you on that. I guess there was the Samaritan demo that Epic put out near the end of Unreal Engine 3's life, and I kind of feel like this is the only game to have attempted to match and exceed what that demo was doing at the time. And this feels like the natural conclusion to the Unreal Engine 3 chapter of Epic, and it kind of pushes it. These guys have pushed the engine to a point that I don't think anybody else has reached yet. And, for obvious reason, by the time this released, I think Unreal Engine 3 was very much on the way out. I mean, I guess Mortal Kombat 10 and maybe even Injustice 2. I can't remember. Those are Unreal Engine 3, I believe. And the Guilty Gear games. Guilty Gear Xrd with that awesome cell shading, not as technically amazing as this, but artistically just stunning. So there's still some impressive games out there with this, but by and large, I think Unreal Engine 3, it's kind of done at this point. So for me, I'm very curious to see what these guys are going to do next. When we know that they worked on Batman Arkham VR, which was probably a small team, but since Arkham Knight, I mean, it's been quiet. We have no idea what these guys are working on. I think I saw some job postings basically suggesting that they're even staffing up at this point. But you'd have to assume now that they've probably moved on to actual next gen now, so we may not even see the game for another like 2 or 3 years. I'm very curious to see what they can do next if they were able to pull this off on the current consoles.
Yeah, it's tremendous, isn't it? But it kind of begs the question, really, of what's going to happen. Well, first of all, there's two questions here, isn't there? What is the new game? We don't even know if it's a Batman game. There are various rumours of Justice Leagues and Superman games. Doesn't seem to be a good fit from my perspective for what Rocksteady have done in the past. So that's the first thing. What are they working on next, and when is it going to appear? We really want to know, don't we? The second point is I kind of feel that Arkham Knight, in fact, all of the Arkham games haven't really transitioned into the current generation or the enhanced console era particularly well. We've got Return to Arkham, which I think there were good intentions behind that, but it didn't really hold up from a technical perspective. And then we've got Arkham Knight here, where, as I mentioned earlier, the only route forward for playing this at higher resolutions and higher frame rate is with an extremely compromised PC version that we're still battling with 3 years later, and only now, using a massive amount of overhead, can we get decent results. So I kind of feel that this game deserves better in terms of transitioning onto later hardware. Beyond the PC version, PlayStation 4 at 1080p 30 is still pretty much the only way to go.
Yeah, maybe next gen we'll see a PlayStation 5 remaster of Arkham Knight 4K 60 on a console. You think it's possible? I'm not sure.
Well, I'd be happy just with a proper Xbox One X and PS4 Pro upgrade at this point.
Absolutely.
Some sort of remaster would be really nice. But I think we're going to leave this here. I think the bottom line here is that you can now, at least, play Arkham Knight at 60 frames per second at super high resolutions. The game still holds up. The game still looks amazing. Obviously the concern is that in terms of optimization, it's still, I think, a disaster zone.
Yeah, it's not great. I mean, our initial thoughts that, hey, maybe this has improved significantly, maybe not the case. It just kind of feels like we're brute forcing through it at this point. But I have to say that the AMD performance there, kind of surprising. I mean, 1440p locking at 60 FPS on the Vega, that's pretty amazing, actually.
Yeah, but the thing is, I could restart the game now and maybe it wouldn't do that. Who knows?
Oh yeah, that's true. That's right. You got the 1060 up there too. Yeah, and yeah, I guess that's the frustrating thing about it is you just don't know.
Yeah, but I think the bottom line is that there is no Spider-Man on Xbox One and PC, but there is still a game that has many similarities, that is a little bit older, but still looks awesome, and I absolutely loved revisiting this one.
Yeah, I've been playing through it in my spare time, actually. It's great.
Okay, well, I think we're going to leave things there. I hope you enjoyed seeing Arkham Knight in a way that, well, I don't think many people have seen before. I certainly had a lot of fun revisiting the game, and you know, if you do have the required hardware to brute force this game into submission, man, I've had a great time with it. But yeah, I think that's where we're going to leave things for now. Please do like and subscribe to support work like this. Ring the bell for instant notifications if you're subscribed already. And yes, a full-on, high-quality, pristine download of this video is available at digitalfoundry.net. But that's all from us for now. Thanks for watching.
Miss me?